Brief summary about the black African slave trade in America. Africa has a long history of slavery. Until the early 16th century, this was done only on a relatively small scale. Before this, most people who were enslaved were taken as prisoners of war or as punishment for a crime. Some were sold to Arab merchants who in many cases sold them as servants for their own benefit. The situation began to change when Europeans began to visit the Atlantic coast of Africa. European explorers were busy colonizing the Americas and the Caribbean islands, and creating large plantations of crops such as sugar cane. In many places, they enslaved the native population to do work for them. But poor conditions and European diseases began to eliminate the natives, so the settlers began looking for workers to replace them with the native population. By the year 1683, almost all the native peoples of the Caribbean were eliminated. Some prisoners were brought from Europe, but they were few in number, and as soon as they arrived they became ill or died shortly after. Colonists began to look to Africa for slaves as cheap labor, thus beginning the slave trade to America on a much larger scale. They were then transported to the Caribbean or Brazil, where they were sold at auction and taken throughout the New World. In the 17th and 18th centuries, enslaved African persons were traded in the Caribbean for molasses, which was made into rum in the American colonies and traded back to Africa for more slaves. The practice of slavery continued in many countries, illegally, into the 21st century. What was the reason for bringing black African slaves to America through the slave trade? The existence of suitable and vacant lands in the Caribbean favored the settlement and cultivation of tropical products that soon reached great demand in Europe: sugar, coffee or cotton. The use of coercive labor was the other factor that ensured that the company was profitable, as it was a cheap labor force, with regular supplies, easy replacement and capture. Large numbers of people were immediately captured in the interior of Africa. Chained so that they could not escape, they were forced to march towards the coast. There they were sold to European slave traders, where they were transported on ships and taken to the New World across the Atlantic. The conditions aboard these ships were terrible, without enough light, air, food or water. The slave ships were designed to carry more than 400 people, packed as close together as possible, on the 2-month voyage from West Africa to the Americas. The hardships suffered on those long voyages across the Atlantic produced such terror among the poor individuals that they came to wish they were dead rather than continue living in those conditions. Father Alonso de Sandoval relates as a witness that the blacks go 6 by 6 chained with rings around their necks, disgusting and mistreated, and then, joined 2 by 2 with rings on their feet. They go below deck, with they never see the sun or the moon. You cannot stay there for an hour without serious risk of acquiring an illness. They eat a bowl of raw corn or millet and a small jug of water every 24 hours. They receive a lot of beating, a lot of whipping and bad words from the only person who dares to go down to the cellar, the foreman. Slave ships sailed from Europe to Africa with weapons and cloth to buy slaves. The slaves were transported in the Middle Passage to the Americas, where they were sold. The ships returned home with sugar, rum and cotton. When African slaves arrived in the Caribbean, South America or in the North American colonies, they were sold at auction to the highest bidder. Africans of different culture, speaking different languages, were thrown together. Since they could not understand each other, this prevented them from making plans for escape. The slaves were chained and packed into a space so small that they could not move. Like many, a third of this group died on each trip that lasted 8 weeks. Those who survived were often separated from their families and sold to different slave owners. The first African slaves in North America arrived in Virginia to work on tobacco plantations in 1619. The slavers carried out the so-called triangular trade. They loaded rum, tobacco and weapons in Europe, exchanged it for slaves and ivory in Africa, and sold the slaves for profit in America, from where they returned with raw materials and minerals to Europe. During transit, approximately 50% of the slaves died. Middle Passage, the forced voyage of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World. It was one leg of the triangular trade route that took goods, such as knives, guns, ammunition, cotton cloth, tools, and brass dishes, from Europe to Africa, Africans to work as slaves in the Americas and West Indies, and items, mostly raw materials, produced on the plantations, sugar, rice, tobacco, indigo, rum, and cotton, back to Europe. The number of slaves left from Africa to Europe and from here to the American continent is counted in millions, just as the gold and ivory extracted from the African continent can also be counted in tons. Productive forces forcibly incorporated into the Western world of work helped lay the foundations for unequal development in the evolution of the economies of the continents that intervened in trafficking, beginning with Africa, passing through Europe and reaching America. This process gave rise, on the one hand, to an increase in production and, on the other, to the expansion of consumer markets worldwide. There are no exact figures on the victims of the atrocities committed. Experts estimate that between the 16th and 19th centuries a total of 100 million people were deported or died during deportation. This figure refers to the total traffic, Western and Eastern, also counting the deaths of the slave wars. Estimates of the number of slaves who were transported to the Americas reach almost 14 million. In parallel, an African slave trade developed, directed especially towards Anglo-Saxon America, Brazil, Haiti and the Spanish Antilles, monopolized mainly by Portuguese and Dutch merchants. It is estimated that between 1501 and 1641 some 620,000 Africans arrived in America. Mass trafficking did not arrive however until the 18th century, mainly at the hands of the English and French, who transported more than 5,500,000 mainly to British America and its sugar possessions in the Caribbean, such as Barbados and Saint-Domingue. The slave faced a hard life on the plantations where the work was hard and the hours were long. On a sugar plantation some slaves worked in the fields and the others worked in the processing factories. Their facilities were poor and they were often poorly fed. Many of them were also whipped or beaten for the smallest mistake and many died shortly after arriving on the plantations. Even the strongest rarely survived for more than 10 years and very few saw their homeland again. Probably no more than a few 100,000 Africans were taken to the Americas before 1600. In the 17th century, however, demand for enslaved labor rose sharply with the growth of sugar plantations in the Caribbean and tobacco plantations in the Chesapeake region in North America. The largest numbers of enslaved people were taken to the Americas during the 18th century, when, according to historians' estimates, nearly 3/5 of the total volume of the transatlantic slave trade took place. The slave trade reached its peak in the 18th century, when between 6 and 7 million people were shipped from Africa to the Americas. The impact on traditional African societies was devastating, destroying entire kingdoms, while others were becoming rich and in power as a result of the slave trade. Historians have debated the nature and extent of European and African agency in the actual capture of those who were enslaved. During the early years of the transatlantic slave trade, the Portuguese generally purchased Africans who had been enslaved during tribal wars. As the demand for enslaved people grew, the Portuguese began to enter the interior of Africa to forcibly take captives. As other Europeans became involved in the slave trade, generally they remained on the coast and purchased captives from Africans who had transported them from the interior. From the 1780s onwards, however, some Europeans began to realize that slavery was cruel and began to campaign against it. The slave was not a passive subject. He did not stop striving to maintain his traditions and conquer spaces of freedom. Since the 16th century, rebellions have occurred. The first was in Hispaniola, island of Santo Domingo, in 1521. Some remained in revolts, others managed to set a new pace in world history. For example, the Saint-Domingue Revolution of 1791, which ended with the creation of Haiti, in 1804, by former slaves. Another form of resistance was the use of the law. Through the slave trustee, they demanded rights and sometimes freedom. Abolition was a slow and uneven process that began in 1838 and ended in 1888. It is worth reflecting that, although some part of European societies, influenced in the 18th and 19th centuries by French philosophers, some British Protestant currents and the papacy, were able to become aware of the genocide that had been carried out for 4 centuries, in a philosophical and moral, other sectors were able to perceive that, given the degree of maturity to which productive relations had reached, fundamentally based on the changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution, slavery was ceasing to be profitable under those conditions. The trade in transporting Africans to the plantations of the Americas generated enormous profits. But it had a great human cost. During the 18th century, many people in Europe and North America, encouraged by new beliefs in human rights, began to condemn slavery. The anti-trade campaigns were finally successful when the slave trade was abolished by the British. Slavery in the United States existed in the 18th and 19th centuries, and previously, among Indians, who commonly enslaved east of the Mississippi, and many west of it as well. Slavery had already been practiced in British North America since early colonial times and was recognized by the 13 colonies at the time of the Declaration of Independence of 1776. After the Revolutionary War, abolitionist laws proliferated in the northern states, although the rapid expansion of the cotton industry from the 1800s left the southern states strongly identified with slavery and attempted to extend it to the new western territories. How were black slaves treated in the United States? Both were forced to perform exhausting work, subjected to physical and mental degradation and deprived of their most basic rights. Enslaved men and women were beaten mercilessly, separated from their loved ones arbitrarily, and, regardless of their sex, treated as property in the eyes of the law. Slavery generally included abuse and cruelty by masters toward slaves, although slaves could often be treated more humanely if they were considered valuable property. Slavery would remain rampant in the United States of America as an independent country. In the U.S. Census, the number of enslaved people in 1790, at the time of its independence, increased from almost 700,000 people to 4 million of people in 1860, shortly before its abolition, an event that also generated strong political tension that led to the American Civil War. Likewise, slavery would persist in the new independent Latin American countries until the second half of the 19th century. In 1822, Liberia was founded in West Africa as a home for freed American slaves, but it was not until the end of the American Civil War of 1865 that slavery ceased to exist in the U.S., while Liberia was founded by the United States while occupied by local Africans. Beginning in 1820, the area was settled by African Americans, most of whom were freed slaves. African captives freed from slave ships by the British and Americans were sent to Liberia rather than being repatriated to their respective African countries of origin. The colonists established a new country with the help of the American Colonization Society, a private organization whose leaders thought that former slaves would have greater opportunity in Africa and that the black population in the United States would remain a permanent racial underclass. Superficial physical differences, such as skin color, rather than genetic ones, contributed to strengthening ideas about the differences between populations that justified slavery, exclusion and racism. According to some historians, Haiti was the first country in Latin America to abolish traditional slavery in 1804. Unfortunately, today it ranks first in Latin America and third in the world in modern slavery, and Brazil was the last country in Latin America to officially abolish slavery. Slavery, in 1888. It is estimated that between the 16th and 19th centuries, more than 3 million slaves arrived in the country from Africa to work on sugar, coffee, and gold mines plantations. That left an indelible mark on Brazil, on the culture, religion and racial diversity of a society that today numbers 190 million people. Something that you must understand: African traditions exist among us. Traditions, foods and plants traveled with the enslaved and mixed with indigenous and European cultures in American lands. This continuous mixing gave rise to new cultures, new racial groups as a result of mixing. In short, the legacy of Africans is part of the daily life of their descendants in America.